LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you had a great week. So, just want to go through the traditional spiel here today. Make sure you're subscribing to the channel. Reach out to us on the Pest Geek Podcast page on Facebook. Join the revolution, as Franklin likes to call it. And certainly we want to be sure that you can raise your questions there. You can also reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. So things are, winter is training season for me when in terms of my day job. So I'll be traveling next week, giving a presentation on the control of prairie dogs on large acreages, so down in southern Montana. So I'm looking to forward to giving that presentation and talking to some producers out there. So trust you're doing well and you're getting ready, of course, for the holiday season. Do take some time to spend time with your family and renew and refresh, and just don't forget to plan for next year. I did a podcast that came out about the end of September or so. They talked about preparing for the new year and some things you'd want to do in your business. You might want to go check that out. So, I have been doing I've recently learned of some changes that were occurring with the EPA on rodenticides, and some of you have already heard about it, saw that on pestcemetery.com, where I guess some notifications went out from one of the watchdog organizations, which is certainly appropriate. And I thought I would do a little bit more of a deeper dive or go through it a little bit more, because certainly my concern is beyond just simply structural applicators. I also want to include those that are handling vertebrate pests out in the agricultural community, because this is living the wildlife, right? So we're talking about wildlife in all contexts, not just simply the urban-dominated areas. But before we get to that, do take a look at my new website. So this has been done by, I don't make any money on this, but I'm with GoDaddy. Have some pros and cons with GoDaddy. I wasn't too happy about some of their censorship of some websites back during the COVID pandemic. I don't know if they're continuing to do that, but a little problematic. And again, it always tends to hit conservatives, of course, and so it never seems to go the other way. Not that we should be doing that. People should be able to speak freely. I'm not talking about, evil material, but it seems that conservatives, for some reason, are evil in today's world. But nevertheless, this is my new site. I just got tired of WordPress. I couldn't stand it anymore. I kept breaking my site. So I do hope you come and check it out. Check out my store. It's going to be easier for you to purchase things, and there's going to be some additional elements on there as well. Of course, podcasts, I do need to update some of the links there, but certainly my interviews and my regular podcasts, I split them out on the page. Do hope you go check that out so you can see the host of material. If you're wondering, I don't have any training material, well, I'm sorry. If you're just driving around in your truck and you're not spending some time learning while you're doing it, I think that's a big mistake. I mean, you should be doing something. I mean, it doesn't have to be learning all the time, but you should be taking advantage of that windshield time to improve your skills. I mean, life is too short and we just don't have time. So certainly there is a wealth of information here. It's been going on for like 4 years now. So there's a lot of material there. I do hope you go check it out. You can also subscribe to my podcast through Rumble. Do hope you check that out as well. Okay, enough of those preliminaries. Let me bring up the document here that I want to discuss today, and I may have to make this into 2 presentations because it is so big. I mean, when the EPA does something, they tend to do it in a big way, right? So here it is. This is the document here. Let me read it for you, for those of you who are driving, right? We don't want you to crash or anything. It's called the Proposed Interim Registration Review Decision for 7 Anticoagulant Rodenticides, and it was published by the EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency, for those of you outside the U.S., in November of 2022. So not very long. I'm recording this on the 12th of December in 2022. So we're talking about something that hasn't been out for very long, even if it came out on November 1st, which I'm not sure what its publication exact date was, but it's listed here as November 2022. So many of you may be familiar. In 2008, the EPA made some dramatic changes in the way pesticides were licensed and labeled. And that was trying to reduce the number of human exposures, particularly with children, and also non-target exposures. Because one of the challenges, of course, with anticoagulant rodenticides is that there's secondary poisoning issues. There's primary poisoning, to be sure. I don't want to ignore that, but secondary poisonings are significant. And as researchers were going out into the landscape, testing, carnivores and predators and scavengers, they were finding that these active ingredients are just everywhere. It seems like every time they're testing an animal, they're finding its presence. Now, we can debate about what the significance of that is, right? There's a big debate about that. That's not the subject of today's presentation. But the fact that they were finding it was raising alarm bells. And many of you are already familiar with what California's done. California's basically made all SGARs kind of illegal to use except in certain situations. So even those people who have pesticide licenses are going to have further restrictions to get access to those second generation anticoagulants. For those of you that are not familiar, first generation anticoagulants are often known as multi-feed. That is, the rodent or animal has to feed on it multiple times to get a toxic dose. Second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, called SGARs, those only require a one feeding to obtain a toxic dose. This is a little simplistic, but it's true enough for our purposes, okay? And you can tell, obviously, that the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides are incredibly toxic. So they are orders of magnitude more toxic than the first generation anticoagulants. Now, that doesn't mean the first FGARs are safe, right? I'm not saying that, but it just means that if you have this level of risk, the SGARs take it above and beyond, just orders of magnitude up. Think of it as earthquake Richter scale, right? So when we say an earthquake is a 1.0 on the Richter scale, a 2.0 isn't twice as big. It's actually orders of magnitude bigger because it's a logarithmic scale, not a linear scale. All right. Well, enough of that. So I wanted to kind of go over some of the highlights of this. And again, this is what the EPA is proposing to have done. So it's not locked in stone. However, I doubt it's going to change much. I mean, think of it like, like the Federal Reserve, right? I mean, when they start notifying people that they're looking to raise interest rates, don't be shocked if they raise interest rates. Same way with the EPA here. This is probably not going to change much, right? So this is going to make some of these changes are going to hurt, especially for those people. Now, for those of you that are illegal and you don't care what the law says, this won't affect you at all, right? I mean, the law only affects the law abider, right? I mean, but nevertheless, I hope that you're all following the law. But this gives us another indication of my constant begging, pleading, cajoling the industry that you have got to become more engaged with government regulation. You have got to be doing that. I know you're busy. I know you're tired. I know you're trying to make a living. But you don't have to be doing the work. You need to be hiring people and getting your associations involved in the politics of it. And that means putting out some money to do it, because it takes money. Someone's got to take their time and monitor this material and lobby the government, because the animal rights protest industry, the so-called environmentalists, are doing it as well. And I'm not saying all the changes here are bad. I'm not saying that at all. I think some of these changes are positive, but some of these changes are going to hurt, and in terms of cost, and there's going to be a consequence for that. And they may not, and I think some of them are a little heavy-handed. And I'm not sure that this is the only way to skin this cat about reducing anticoagulant non-target exposures. Okay, so I think this is a little bit more complicated. But again, the EPA has a hammer, and when you have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? And so this is one of the challenges with the EPA. And I'm not telling they're bad people or anything. I'm not suggesting that. But sometimes when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think this is one of the problems of the EPA. And the other issue is our industry has not done an adequate job, I think, lobbying them and giving them wider perspective. But all right, enough of all that. Let's get into this particular document. So I've made some notes to try to save some time. It is 92 pages. Now, I have not read every word, and I'm not suggesting that I have read every word, but I have scanned through this sufficiently, I think, to kind of give you a sense of what's going on with it. So let's give a little bit of a start on what I have here for my first comment. And that is, the EPA, when they put out some of their initial comments on things, because they did some evaluations of chlorofazanone, difazanone, warfarin, brodifacoum, bromadiolone, difenacoum, and difethalone. And here's the number of comments they received. So they received 55. Let me blow that up for you, for those of you that may be watching online. All right, so let me try to, a little bit too big there. Okay, so chlorofazanone, they received, now chlorofazanone is manufactured by Leafitech, and that is, they got 55 comments. Difazanone, which I think is produced by Neogen Symmetrics, I think it might be Neogen, don't quote me on that, they only got 7. Warfarin got 755. What's the deal with warfarin? So I haven't quite figured that out. Now, your second generation anticoagulants, 8 comments were done on brodifacoum, 10 on bromadiolone, 5 on difenacoum, 7 on difethalone. So figure that out. So warfarin got 755 comments, which is more than all the other active ingredients listed here combined. Probably 3 times more, maybe 4. No, actually, it's got to be more than that. 7 times more. That's amazing to me. So I haven't been able to figure that out. So my point here is that the EPA does ask for comments, and they're going to be asking for comments on this proposed decision. So what I'm talking about with you today, it's not set in stone, but I would argue the concrete is hardening as we speak. Okay, but so it depends what kind of pushback, because again, we say follow the science. Well, that's kind of simplistic. Scientists aren't objective as much as they want to claim they are, and your biases do color how you perceive the data, right? No fact is uninterpreted. Let me give an illustration for that. So here's the philosophy geek in me. I had an undergrad degree in philosophy. And one of the things is that when you look at the sun, what do you see? Well, you may see a ball of fire, right? Because the sun is a star that has a ball of fire. Well, an atheist looks at a sun differently than that. He looks at it as a ball of fire that was created by accident. There's no God involved. Where a theist would look at a sun as being an object created by a God. Same fact, the sun exists. Both the atheist and the theist believe the sun exists, but notice how they interpret the sun in 2 fundamentally different ways. One, the sun is an accident of cosmic forces that are non-personal, where a theist would see the sun as created by a being, a personal God. Okay, so this is what the problem is. So the same thing when we're looking at scientific data doesn't just necessarily interpret itself, right? You have to come at it with certain biases. So this is affecting. So we have these comments coming in from people, and let's go to the next one. So I want to basically point out who was commenting here. So let me kind of scroll down, and notice we have various organizations commenting. You have people like Animal Advocates, Animal Legal Defense Fund, Center for Biological Diversity, City Wildlife, Green Foothills, In Defense of Animals, Project Coyote, Wildlife Emergency Services. Now, these are comments all opposing the continued registration of rodenticides. So they're clearly getting comments from various lobby groups and various interest groups wanting to ban anticoagulant rodenticides. That's pretty significant, right? So are there arguments in favor of it? And so they go through the various comments they've received and the EPA's response. Now, here we have an example of the MPMA. The MPMA also commented. Now, obviously, they're in favor of anticoagulants, but my point here is not to evaluate the level of their comment here. That's not the point. My point is did you find your association making a comment on this? Whether you have a pest control association, wildlife control association, maybe some sort of business trade group, whatever the case may be, for the people listening to my voice here, if you're involved in pest control or you're involved in wildlife control, did you comment, or not you personally, but did your organization where you send your membership dues, did they comment on this preliminary draft of the EPA? Now, you can comment about this draft now, but the EPA was also talking to individuals prior to their development of this particular interim proposed decision. Okay, so think of it. So the EPA puts out notification, hey, we're looking to do this. People respond. Then they come out with their official proposed solution, and then they ask for comment again. The problem is by the time they put out this document, things are pretty much, I can't say set in stone, but again, the concrete is hardening. So you kind of have two bites at the apple here, okay? Obviously, the goal is to make this document be edited before it's published, right? But it's too late now. The time to have the EPA change was back several months ago. And this is obviously a problem. And so, did your organization participate in this? And if not, why not? Do they not have enough money? Do they care? Did they know about it? And so this is what are you doing with your money? So is it just training that you're involved with your association, or should your association be involved in political issues? Because for some of you, this document's if this gets implemented, the labels are changed, and you believe in abiding by the law, which I hope you do, this is going to have an impact on your business in a negative financial way. It may help you in some ways, but it's going to have a negative consequence. And that means it's going to have a consequence on your customer base. Okay? So think about that if you would. So this isn't a central piece of this particular presentation today, but I just wanted to point this out as a side note. Many times I get the impression, maybe I'm just going to make this not a scientific fact or from research data, but my feeling is many people who use rodenticides think that second generation anticoagulant rodenticides are faster than first generation anticoagulants. Well, because it makes sense. First gens, it takes multiple doses to kill the rodent. Second gens, it takes one and done. Well, but notice what this particular comment says from the EPA. It says, and I'll read it for you for those of you who are riding along. It says, however, the lag time between obtaining a lethal dose to mortality does not differ substantially between FGARs and SGARs. Did you know that? Did you know that the time it takes to kill a rodent eating a FGAR is essentially the same as an FGAR? an SGAR. So first generation anticoagulants and second generation anticoagulants kill the rodent at about the same speed. That's amazing. So if you didn't know that, I hope you take that particular fact to heart. So don't think that SGARs are automatically faster in terms of the rodent control. I'm really going to hit them with the second gen, and I'm going to get a faster kill rate. Nope, you're not. If you want to get a faster kill rate, you really need to use something like a zinc phosphide to get a faster kill rate, because that'll kill within 24 hours. Okay, so just something for you to think about that a lot of people may not know. All right, so what is the rationale behind why the EPA wanted to make some of these changes? Well, because they're concerned about non-target exposures to rodenticides, which is certainly a worthy goal. I mean, we all should be concerned about that. But what I wanted to point out here was, notice the comment, and this is where it shows where biases come in, why data doesn't interpret itself. And I want to read this sentence to you. It says, almost all the incidents occurring, this is to children who get poisoned by rodenticides less than 6 years old. It says almost all incidents occurring due to rodenticide exposure are the result of label directions to keep a bait away from children and pets and non-target wildlife not being followed. Now, why do I point that out? My point is that all the regulations in the world don't mean a thing if the person at the other end isn't following the directions. And my problem here is that, again, remember when I said the EPA has a hammer, and when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So the EPA, the only thing they can do is add more regulations, but regulations only work for people who are willing to follow the regulations. And that's a big gap between what you want to have done and what will be done. This is why if you're going to make changes with people, a lot of times you have to make them structural or in the equipment itself so that you nudge them in the proper way. For example, selling bait only in bait stations. Now, obviously, that would create a lot more waste. It would be raising the cost of your rodenticides because someone could say, well, I'm just going to get a reusable bait station and then just buy my bait directly and reuse it, and then just not use the bait station. So this is the problem that we have here, in that when you have, let's say, a child and you tell your child the curfew is at 10 o'clock, and of course they're showing up at 10:30, what do? You turn around and you say, okay, your curfew now is 9, and you're hoping they show up by 10. In some ways, that's kind of what these regulations are doing. But I'll leave that to you. Let's take a look at the next one here. Now, the EPA did what's called a Tier 1 updated analysis. Now, I'm not familiar. They talked about a Tier 1 and a Tier 2. I'm not familiar with what kind of analysis those are and how they're differentiated, so I can't comment on that. But anyways, it sounds serious, right? So they completed a Tier 1 updated analysis of exposure incidents for anticoagulant and non-anticoagulant rodenticides using data in IDS and AAPCC. Although the data suggests that the overall frequency of rodenticide incidents appears to be decreasing over time, incidents continue to occur. Now, what's the translation of that? What it means is that the EPA has noticed that fewer people are becoming exposed to rodenticides. But it's not perfect. Well, that sounds like good news, right? The 2008 decision that they made seems to be working, right? It's reduced the number of people getting exposed to rodenticides. Well, that sounds like a win. But the EPA is not happy with it. And so this becomes an issue. This isn't a scientific question. This is a policy question. And that is, when is low enough? If the goal is 0 exposures to humans, is that really reasonable? If we said we want to reduce vehicle deaths in the United States, I think that's a worthy goal. But at what cost? Do we have to drive a tank now? Only driving 35 miles an hour? Or do we just simply say that, their driving is risky, we need to enforce the law, of course, we need to have proper training, we need to have safe vehicles, but you know what? It's just, we're not going to shut down society just because we have a death rate with vehicles. That's the question, right? And this is where your lobbying has to come into play, and I don't think a lot of people in the industry truly appreciate that. All right, well, let's keep going. Let's take a look down into the next one. So here we have an example. It says that rodenticide exposures from 2011 to 2017 identified a 46% decline in child rodenticide incident reports. Further analysis of the data indicates that the number of SGAR, that's second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, has decreased by 79% from 164 incidents in 2009 to 34 incidents in 2018. However, FGAR incidents have increased over this time by 81%, from 10 incidents in 2009 to 52 incidents in 2018. Well, that makes perfect sense when you have a big state like California, basically making it really hard to get second-generation anticoagulants. And, of course, you have the 2008 decision. People are going to be using FGARs more often because they're easier to access. And so, therefore, with more in the field, you're going to obviously have more exposures to children. That just simply makes sense. Overall review of IDS and AAPCC data suggests that the 2008 RMD, those are the rodenticide decisions that was made in 2008, may have contributed to an overall decrease in exposure incidents involving rodenticide products. So they're arguing here that their proposed changes probably worked. And okay, well, let's take them at their word then, that they worked. But the EPA is not happy. And that's the problem. What is the end point? Is it perfection? Are we to get to a society where there's zero rodenticide exposures to children or humans? Is that a reasonable expectation? Is that really reasonable? I don't think so. And sometimes, again, when everything's a nail, with your hammer, you get bad results. But nevertheless, I'm just putting that out there for something for you to think about. They also give data on which active ingredients were involved with the most non-target exposures. And they did this by active ingredient. And I want to read this section for you. It's a little bit technical, but I hope it kind of drives the point home. Now, the EPA gets reports from individuals, perhaps enforcement, perhaps self-reporting, and also research scientists that are going out in the field and doing these types of surveys to determine where these non-target poisonings are occurring. And so they're reported to the EPA. The EPA collects this data and then uses it in form of their risk evaluation of various rodenticides. And this is what they said. By rodenticide, brodifacoum was detected in 60% of bird-related incidents. Those are incidents where there was a non-target exposure or they were looking for it. Bromadiolone was in 19%. Difethalone was in 11%. Difenacoum was in 1.2%. Chlorofascinone in 3.2%. Difascinone 5.0%. And warfarin 1.5%. For mammals, there were 607 incidents in which anticoagulant rodenticides were involved, of which SGARs that's the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, were detected in 78% of the incidents, and FGARs were detected in 22%. By rodenticide, brodifacoum was detected in 43% of mammal-related incidents, bromadiolone in 26%, difethalone in 8.6%, difenacoum in 0.66%, chlorofascinone in 5.4%, difascinone in 14%, and warfarin in 2.1%. And this is what the conclusion of the EPA was on the basis of that exposure data. It said incidents reported to the IDS are evidence that non-target species are being exposed to anticoagulant rodenticides, resulting in poisonings via primary and secondary exposure. Incidents reported to IDS in 2019 include the following federally protected and listed species: bald eagle, golden eagle, kangaroo rat, key deer, lynx and San Joaquin kit fox, EPA has concluded that anticoagulant rodenticide incidents continue to occur and that there has been no apparent decrease in incidents since the implementation of 2008 RMD. That's their recommendation. That was done in 2008 that we're living under now. So their argument here is like we're still seeing all of these non-target exposures to various anticoagulants. Something needs to be done. Okay, fair enough. However, did you know that part of the challenge, of course, is we don't have any real information on what's the difference between an exposure and an exposure that causes a detrimental effect. In other words, you may test my body here, and you may find maybe there's some chlorofascinone in my system. I don't know. But is it affecting me in a negative manner? That's a different question. So finding something and having it being a negative effect is two different things, because we can test things down to the billionth, which is really small. So something, again, to think about. But this is their rationale, and this is why they're pushing ahead with some of these changes. Additional raw data, just so that you can see that here. Chlorofascinone had 54 wildlife incidents. Difascinone had 122. Warfarin had 23. And on the second gens, you had brodifacoum had 658. Bromadiolone, 278, difenacoum, 12, and difethalone, 124. And I would suggest that part of the reason for the differences in number here, brodifacoum, of course, is the most toxic of your second-generation anticoagulants, but also I think it's commonly used. So some of this may be just a reflection of the number of toxicants being used on the landscape that have this active ingredient in. Remember, statistics don't lie, but how you manipulate those statistics can, and how you understand them, can be misunderstood in many ways. So here's what the agency is proposing for all these changes. So we have all the negative news here. They're finding that human exposures haven't been decreased, have decreased, but not enough in their opinion. And then they still have secondary poisonings and non-target exposures to various wildlife species. So clearly that the 2008 recommendations haven't worked sufficiently. So now what do? And so the EPA is proposing the following changes to our pesticide labels. Here's the first one. All SGAR products would be restricted use. So anything on the second generation anticoagulants, that's your bromadiolone, your difenacoum, your difethalone, your bromadiolones, all of those would be RUPs. The non-licensed public would not be able to get access. All FGAR products, all first generation anticoagulants, packaged in over 4 pounds, would also have to require a license as well. That would also be restricted use. That's a big change. The next change is the personal protective equipment, your PPE. This is a big one in my opinion. They define loose formulations they believe have the capacity to generate particulates and therefore the potential for dermal and inhalation exposures to these products as they are applied, distributed, used to refill bait stations or otherwise contacted. So they're going to require a lot more work, and particularly it's the respirator requirements and glove requirements are being added. So they are proposing updating the respirator statement on anticoagulant rodenticide labels, and it basically should state this, that you have to have a half-mask elastometric respirator. Oops, let me go back to finish it. Along with associated fit testing, training, medical evaluation requirements. So are they going to require that to be documented? That's going to be a big deal for those of you that are one-man operations out there. Not a big deal probably for those of you that have employees and you're having all of those types of headaches and reasons. You're probably already doing a lot of this, demonstrating that your employee has a fit test and goes through that on an annual basis. For products that are meal baits, so this is what they call those particle ones, right? Meal baits, tracking powders, grain meals, and even, this is what kind of surprised me, waxy, paraffinized, and non-paraffinized pellets that are not contained in tamper-resistant bait stations. So if you're handling any of these items that are not already encapsulated into a bait station, you're going to need to be wearing a respirator. Okay, I had a little technical glitch there. So I was referring to the fact that you had to have not only gloves, of course, that you've been wearing anyways, but you also have to be wearing a respirator because the EPA is concerned about when you're using pelletized products, as they define it, that you may get some exposure to these rodenticides through the aerolization of the anticoagulant. So you're going to have to be wearing a half face mask when you're handling these products in the future if this particular proposed update goes through. And as I said before, I would think the likelihood is rather high. Well, I'm going to stop there because I had a little glitch with my computer. So we will continue this. And I've only gotten down here to, let's see, what page am I at? Page 54. Not much left, but there's a few items there we can talk about next time and then try to summarize some of these changes for you. So changes coming, and I think the high points are going to be all of your second gens are going to be restricted use. Any of your first gens, 4 pounds or over 4 pounds, are going to be restricted use. You're going to have to be wearing gloves, of course, and you're going to be wearing a respirator when you're using pelletized anticoagulant products. So this is going to be a significant shift. And the EPA is doing this because of human exposures. Although they're not down enough in their opinion. And of course, they're still seeing these anticoagulant rodenticides out into non-target animals, and they want to try to shut some of that down. My personal opinion is I think that a lot of this is being driven, of course, by California and various environmental I call them so-called environmental groups. But that is these non-target issues a problem? The answer is yes. The question is how best do we address this, and how do we get it? My personal point would be I think the EPA should have spent far more time focusing on enforcement, but I don't think they have that authority. Enforcement is a bigger issue. In other words, you can make all the traffic laws you want, but if people ignore the signs, it doesn't matter how many traffic signs you have. This is where enforcement comes in, because people they don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. And I think the same thing happens because only a certain portion of the population follows the law because they have the moral capacity to do so. Other people need, let's just put it mildly, they need a little assistance to help them understand they're supposed to follow the law. All right, well, thank you very much for staying with us. I hope you found this informative, if not a little bit depressing, but I do hope that you're going to encourage your organization, whatever type of business or association you're in, that they need to be involved in this. And so if you're pushing for your agenda or someone else is going to push their agenda on you. And I'm quite concerned about the industry, both wildlife control primarily, because that's what I'm involved in, and also pest control, that I'm not sure we are pushing back enough. However, kudos to the MPMA. They were involved in this early process, and certainly more work has to be done in this particular area. But they were sort of a lone voice. A lot of the other voices were really focusing in on from the manufacturer side of things, and you wonder how much weight that carries with the EPA. I don't know. I don't have any inside knowledge on that. But the MPMA spoke out, but a lot of other organizations, you would have thought that every state association would have reached out and said something. But nevertheless, Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. You can also visit me on Rumble and just go to Wildlife Control Consultant. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. And, of course, if you have ideas, criticisms, comments, I would love to hear those as well. Do visit us on Facebook with the Pest Geek Podcast family. Join us there, talk about your triumphs and your trials, and even ask questions as well in that particular community. We'd love to hear from you. And again, finally, this is Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.